This is the Kitsap Sun Editorial Board meeting with the candidates for the 6th District Congressional seat. And it really doesn't matter who we let go first. We'll do it alphabetically and let Bill Driscoll begin.
Great, thank you. Bipartisanship is about treating people with respect, and it's about placing intellectual honesty above party politics. I've been married to my wife, Lisa Hoffman, for 17 years. She's a university professor, smart as heck, and a lifelong Democrat. So I know something about bipartisanship. I am not a politician. This is the first time I've run for office, and I'm not going to be your typical candidate. I am a Republican. I am pro-choice. I support marriage equality, and I have not signed the Grover Norquist pledge. I am an independent thinker. I am not a typical Republican. I also will not be a typical candidate. I will be the only member of the Washington State Congressional Caucus who has combat experience, who has served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I will be the only member of the Washington State Congressional Caucus who has overseas experience, having lived and worked 4 years in China, having spent years exporting products from the United States to Asia. And I will be the only member of the caucus who has extensive business experience, 20 years manufacturing experience, selling product, working in all kinds of business. I support a more cautious foreign policy. It is absolutely critical to me that we address the debt and the deficit, and those are the two reasons that I got into this race. We have to address the debt and the deficit in a bipartisan, effective way. And we have to have a more cautious foreign policy. I believe our politicians got us involved in 2 wars, which didn't make sense. And I understand the costs to both the individuals and their families. So once again, thank you very much for having us here, and I look forward to time to talk to you.
Well, I think what we need more of in Washington, D.C. is people who are willing and able to work together to get things done, particularly when it comes to getting this economy back on track. And I've shown the ability to do that on the jobs front. I grew up in Port Angeles right around the time the timber industry was taking it on the chin. Saw a lot of my friends' parents lose their jobs, a lot of my neighbors lose their jobs, and it had a real impact on me. So I went off to college and graduate school, studied public policy with a focus on economic development. Came back, worked in business. I was a consultant for McKinsey & Company for a number of years. And then I spent the last decade working in economic development as vice president of the Economic Development Board for Tacoma-Pierce County. And in that capacity, meet with about 200 businesses a year with an eye towards keeping them and growing them in our area. I've taken that experience to Olympia to work in a bipartisan way on efforts to help our small businesses. Passing laws to reduce the taxes on our small businesses, to reduce the regulatory burden. Establishing a new mechanical engineering program here at Olympic College to not just help our local students, but also to provide opportunities for the shipyard and for our local manufacturers. A few years ago, when the Franciscan Health System wanted to build a new hospital, it almost got derailed because they didn't have adequate road infrastructure, and I was able to pass a new law to help that project move forward, which now created 450 new jobs in our area. Was able to work with the city of Bremerton on an infrastructure bill that enabled the construction of the new parking garage just a couple blocks from here, and to draw private sector economic development in the form of the new movie theater and other commercial developments. I think we need to get people back to work. I also think we need to get this Congress back to work. We've had too much partisan bickering and not enough results. I'm the only candidate in this race with a record of actually getting things done in a bipartisan way. This last year, we passed a bipartisan budget that, as the vice chair of the Senate Ways and Means Committee, I helped write, worked together, and passed it together. The fastest growing area of state spending is debt service, and was able to co-author a debt reduction proposal that'll be on the ballot this November. So I look forward to answering your questions.
You know what? Let's stick with that one for just a minute, because you started with it. Maybe you got cut off just there a little bit. Every story I read out of Congress, all it talks about is how these guys are at each other's throats, or they sign a pledge that I will never do this, I won't do that. The upset over the Ryan budget, whatever you want to say. And
yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about, you go in, you're a rookie. How do you even have an impact on that? What's the first thing you start doing? And maybe something from your own character makeup that you think helps you do that. start with Derek this time.
Sure. When I got elected, I sat down with a guy named Tom Swayze, who used to represent this area. He was a moderate Republican, and we were in Rotary together. And he took me out for coffee, and he gave me 2 words of advice. He said, first of all, with every bill you sponsor, at least try to get bipartisan co-sponsorship, because when you work together to solve problems, you usually come up with better solutions. The other thing he said to me was, every bill that comes before you, just vote what you think is right. He said there's Democrats with good ideas and some with dumb ones, and that there's Republicans with good ideas and some with dumb ones. Vote for the good ones. Vote against the dumb ones. And I've done that. You know, it's why I've been willing to buck my party. I mean, I think folks remember a couple years ago when the legislature increased the business and occupation tax. I was one of the few Democrats to vote against it because I work with small businesses for a living. I thought that was the wrong approach. Working in a bipartisan way to deal with things like workers' comp reform and debt reduction at the state level. I've stood on 52,000 porches over the last 8 years. The vast majority of people I talk to do not care about whether we get more Democratic or more Republican, or move more to the left or more to the right. They just want us to stop moving backward and start moving forward. And so part of it is having that ethic of being willing and able to work with each other. Part of it means not having an ethic where you define success as making sure the other side looks like failures. We've got to be willing to actually work together, and I have experience and a record of having done that.
So I think bipartisanship is not just in the political world. When I worked in the Longview Mill, Weyerhaeuser's Longview Mill in Longview, Washington in the early 90s, that mill was facing closure because of the spotted owl had increased chip costs, and we had to come together to save jobs there, and we did. And management worked together with the union. We were able to lower costs, and we also were able to go out and access new markets in Asia, to which higher value markets to keep that mill alive. And it still is there today and is exporting millions of dollars to Asia and is employing hundreds of people. So bipartisanship is not just in the legislature, it's in real life everywhere we are. I think it is important, though, that to truly be bipartisan, I think you have to be willing to buck your party and be independent from that. And like I've mentioned before, it's not very often I'm the most liberal guy sitting around a table, but working with the other Republican candidates, I was. And I held firm to my communication to what was important to me, whether I was talking to folks up in Clallam County, all Republican group, or at SQUIM, and very consistent. And I think it's, again, being intellectually honest about how you're going to do it. Personally, what would I do there? I'm going to go out and find every single Afghan and Iraqi veteran and identify bonds that transcend political boundaries and work on veterans issues and those and try and expand beyond that.
Seems like most of the things you've broken with your party with are more the social issues.
Grover Nordquist, Spending Pledge.
True, that's another one. And the big one that it seems is real divisive these days is the Affordable Care Act. Maybe what's going to happen to Medicare with the voucher program, something like that. What's a bipartisan approach to solving this Medicare question and this health care question that you'd be willing to go for? And maybe give an example of something that's what your party's pushing that you say, I can hold back on that. What would you vote against to make this so it works? We'll start with Bill.
Okay, so on Medicare, I think it's really important to recognize that the Medicare proposal that's being put out by Congressman Ryan and Democratic Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, which is being vilified by the Democrats as ending Medicare, is actually has its genesis in bipartisan efforts. Paul Ryan working with Alice Rifkin in the Erskine-Bowles program. It was a bipartisan effort. Ryan brought it out one time. It was shot down. He then adjusted it to work with Ron Wyden. So to me, that is an example of a bipartisan approach. It's very important, right? It ensures that people who are currently on Medicare and 55 and over are going to be protected. It is an approach to try and come up with a solution to something that we know has to get addressed. The CBO has just said that if Medicare is going to run out of money in the year 2022 if we don't do something about it. Ron Wyden said doing nothing with Medicare is dangerous for the Medicare guarantee. We have to do something. And again, vilifying that plan because it's the messenger is the wrong thing to do. To me, that's what's wrong with Congress. And bipartisanship says, let's look at what's in there. It's a bipartisan approach. Let's work off of that.
What things in there do you see that you think could appeal to more Democrats?
Well, I think taking a look at it. So it was adjusted, so it's a voucher program. But first what it does is it gives seniors the option of staying with what is there today. So the worst case is you stay with what's there today. And the idea is let's create an innovation that perhaps will allow us to bend the cost curve. To me, that makes sense.
Would you vote to repeal the act entirely?
I would, and the reason is, number one, it was passed strictly on a partisan basis, and something that's going to address as much a bigger part of our economy, as big a number of people, I think needs to be done on a partisan basis. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid were all done bipartisan previous to that. Secondly, it was passed on the basis that it was going to cost $900 billion. The CBO has now come out and said it's going to cost $1.7 trillion. And so in my mind, we have got to go back and look at the cost curves. There's a lot of good things in it. And so by repealing it, I don't think we want to get rid of everything, but we do need to address it in a bipartisan fashion.
I would say, Derek, you can
Do you want me to talk about Medicare or the Affordable Care Act or both?
either one. I'm going to give you a chance to answer both.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the Affordable Care Act. There's certainly elements that I can appreciate. I have a 6-year-old who's had some healthcare problems. Some of you in this room know that. And I like the fact that she won't be denied coverage someday for having pre-existing conditions. I like the fact that the young people who are volunteering on my campaign can stay on their parents' insurance until their 26th birthday. I like the fact that my grandmother, who's 102 years old, doesn't fall into the prescription drug donut hole when it comes to being able to get affordable prescription drugs. I like the fact that preventive care, like mammograms and cancer screenings and immunizations, are covered. I think there's some areas where I think it needs some work. So, for example, this district that I'm seeking to represent has a lot of rural healthcare providers, and many of them are just hanging on for dear life right now. I think more needs to be done for our rural healthcare providers. Second, I think more needs to be done for our small businesses. I work with about 200 small businesses a year. The vast majority of them, if they don't provide healthcare, it's not because they don't want to. It's because they can't afford to. And there is some tax relief and tax credits, but I think the federal government needs to go quite a ways further in that regard if we're going to help our small businesses actually afford to provide health insurance. And then finally, to me, more needs to be done with regard to the affordability of our healthcare system, actually trying to do more around cost containment. There is bipartisan agreement that you can do things like electronic medical billing, electronic medical records, try and reduce some of the transactional costs within the healthcare system and drive costs down by billions, tens of billions of dollars. And the fact that even though there's bipartisan agreement to do that, it hasn't happened is, to me, demonstration of how broken our Congress is right now. On the Medicare front, there's a couple other examples in that regard. You could just look at prescription drug discounting like we do within Medicaid and within the VA, and it would save $120 billion. There's bipartisan agreement to do this. Second, at the state level this last year, in a bipartisan way, we passed a bill dealing with Medicaid fraud. For every $1 you invest in fraud reduction, you save $7 into the system. You could do the exact same thing within the Medicare system, and there's generally bipartisan agreement to do this, and the fact that that hasn't happened is, to me, an indication that we need to step up, make hard decisions, and be willing to act.
Is the idea of vouchers something you're willing even to start talking about?
I don't like the idea of doing away with the Medicare guarantee. Doing something that puts the onus on the back of retirees who depend on it, and by most accounts would drive up the cost for most seniors, I think is not the right idea.
Are there any examples, because I mentioned this when I introduced Bill with this question, that there's places where he maybe breaks with his party socially. What about you? What's in the Democratic platform right now that maybe you don't agree with, or you'd be willing to say, if this gets us to a place where we can agree on stuff, I can give this one up?
Sure. Well, I have a record of doing that, particularly on fiscal issues and on business climate issues. Over the years, I've opposed the increase in the business and occupation tax. I opposed the instatement of an estate tax at the state level, largely because I work with a lot of small family-owned businesses that I thought would be negatively impacted by that. I was part of the effort to reform our state's workers' compensation system, which was a very difficult issue that had a lot of blowback from a lot of Democrats. But when you work with as many employers as I do, you hear common concerns around that workers' comp system and the costs associated with it. So I was willing to stand up to our party's leadership and do what I thought was right. So particularly on the fiscal issues and on the business climate issues, I'm certainly willing to buck my party. Also, as I look at our party platform, I've been a strong supporter of the Second Amendment and am not for further steps in terms of more gun laws. So I've been willing to buck my party on those sorts of issues as well.
What about this is just the main one, it seems like it's talked about at the federal level, the Bush tax cuts and whether those will stay in effect or be taken back. Is that
Sure.
is that one of these fiscal issues that you're talking about, that you're willing to find middle ground, leave alone?
Well, I think dealing with our deficit will require finding a middle ground and trying to deal with this in a bipartisan way. And certainly my approach has always been to focus on growing jobs, not on growing taxes. I think dealing with the deficit means something and balancing budget means something. I've actually done it at the state level and it's not easy. That said, I would, to me, we should absolutely continue tax cuts for our small businesses and the temporary tax cuts that were put in place for middle-class families, because I don't think they can afford to see their taxes go up. I do not think if we want to get serious about dealing with our deficit, we should extend tax breaks for millionaires who don't need them. I don't think that makes sense. What that means is going back to the tax policies for the wealthiest Americans that existed under Bill Clinton, which was a period of record economic growth and at record low unemployment.
Same question for you, Bill.
Sure.
You said you wouldn't sign the Northwest Pledge. What is your opinion on particularly that Bush tax cuts that's going to be discussed?
Yeah, so I certainly agree that we should extend it, because I don't want to do anything that would derail the economy today. We differ a little bit in terms of on the tax on the wealthiest, and the issue from my standpoint simply is that I don't want to do anything piecemeal. I would absolutely support raising revenue as part of a comprehensive solution, right? So this increase on the millionaires would cover about 3% of the annual deficit, $1.4 trillion annual deficit. So doing that by itself isn't going to adjust anything, and I'm just concerned it's just going to get spent. And so, but as part of an overall comprehensive plan to go after the deficit, absolutely we're going to have to look at revenue. Personally, I would much prefer to have a simplified tax code. I think rather than raising marginal tax rates, let's get rid of a whole bunch of deductions and things that have been put in, I think, for political reasons, loopholes, and let's simplify that. Makes it easier for everybody to comply with. I think distorts economic behavior differently. And everybody knows that GE didn't pay any taxes this year. It doesn't make any sense. That's an example of loopholes going too far.
When you say simplify, what I've read is the very simple, and I forget if this is Ryan or Romney, two brackets and that's it. Is that too simple?
That's, I'm not a tax expert, so my framework for looking at things is how do we keep it simple, how do we make it easy for businesses to comply with. An example there is some of the new rules about providing incentive for people to hire veterans, hire new workers, is so complicated and takes so much compliance that most small and even medium-sized businesses aren't taking advantage of it. It's too hard to work. So I'm concerned that as you get these incentives and loopholes in, it becomes difficult to comply with and doesn't reach the ultimate purpose, and oftentimes become political instead of achieving the social good you're looking for. So lowering marginal tax rates, but at the same time doing that in a way where you're not lowering revenue, and if we have to increase revenue, that comes out in the mix.
What about you? He's mentioning job creation, how we make things a little easier for business. But what's the strategy from your side?
Well, I think tax policy can certainly be part of that. And I will agree. If you look at the federal tax code, and I've spoken with this editorial board about some of the tax policies that exist at the state level. I mean, some of the tax breaks don't make sense either at the state level or at the federal level. I mean, they have a tax break for thoroughbred racehorses and for importers of Chinese ceiling fans. With apologies to any of you who are racehorse owners. I just don't think that makes sense if you want to be serious about dealing with our deficit. So in that regard, I think that's something we should look at. More broadly, as we look at jobs, there's, I do this for a living. My background is working in economic development. I look at economic development a lot like a business selling a product. You have to have a good product and you need to sell it well. Step one is keeping the customers you have, which means keeping the employers you have, whether that be trying to preserve jobs at the shipyard or trying to preserve jobs here in our downtown here in Bremerton. The foundation of that, if you look at how we generally make it out of recessions, is small businesses. generally speaking, the vast majority of job creation doesn't come from the Microsofts and Boeings of the world. It comes from small businesses. And what the federal government does and doesn't do in that regard makes a real difference. From a tax and regulatory standpoint, making sure you have tax policies that don't stifle the ability of our small businesses to grow, making sure from a regulatory standpoint our businesses don't feel like they're shooting at a moving target, making sure that that there's access to capital so businesses can make investments and grow their business, ensuring that our workers, that our employers can find good skilled workers matters. Ensuring that we have, basic infrastructure like roads and sewers to promote economic development. And we know that in the district I've been representing, where we've had a series of building moratoria because of inadequate infrastructure. Ensuring that our small businesses can access export markets is all part of that equation. We have a sign up in the office where I work in my day job that says we are competing with everyone, everywhere, every day, forever. And I think that's part of the ethic that we should have when improving the competitiveness of our country.
Why don't you take that question, because I know you
Sure.
you kind of have a background as a warehouser, and that's an industry.
Well, more than that, yeah.
Part of the 6th District. So.
Mhm. So in me, from my standpoint, from a job standpoint, that what we need to do is jobs are created by the private sector, and that's where the growth comes, and that's what we need to really focus on. In this district specifically, obviously maintaining the bases is huge importance. And not just the bases themselves, but of course all the ancillary effects that they have on that and the industries around them. And I think, again, my experience overseas and my experience in the military are crucial to that. The key for those bases is going to be ensuring that America and Congress understands the strategic importance of those bases, again, in terms of the Asian Pacific area and China and emerging threats to China, India, and others. And again, my experience overseas, I think, is important for that. So maintaining those bases is important. Second, trade. Again, 4 years living and working in China, years before that exporting product. Trade is crucial to this district and to Washington State overall. So I think jobs get driven, ensuring we have good access to trade, and we have good trade policies to incent both our big companies but also our small companies to do that. Education, critically important. My wife's a university professor, and STEM education, focusing on that and really helping with the transition of military veterans who are leaving the bases, leaving active duty to enter the workforce, either retiring or just leaving active duty, entering the workforce, is very important and a great source of energy and drive for this economy, I believe.
Let's talk about that base question that you
Yeah.
both brought up. Obviously, that's what Representative Dix was really well known for, is making sure there was work to do coming into the shipyard. Maybe approach it with telling me what your defense strategy is, what you're going to vote for. Obviously, if elected, you're a younger member of the chamber. You're not going to be in the same position. But when you talk military strategy, when you talk armed forces, when they talk about Pentagon cuts, what are you going to say? This is why we need to have the work here. I'll let Phil go first.
Okay. The lens through which I look at military spending and cuts is having seen young men die in combat. And to me, the number one criteria is our dollars being spent to improve the training and our capability to project power and to succeed in our mission overseas. Now, the great thing about the bases here is they are crucial to our strategic position as we look out over the next century. The Navy obviously has recognized that as the shift has come over and shifting more resources to Asia and the Pacific Rim. That is where we're going to be spending a significant amount of time and effort, and that's where challenges and opportunities are from. These bases are perfectly well situated for that. And I think being able to defend that. Defending these bases is not about defending pork. And we would, as a freshman congressman, we're going to lose that battle, right? This is about the strategic importance of these bases. And I think that's very evident. And again, my time both in Asia, but also my time having been served in harm's way in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think it's important being able to address that and communicate with the appropriate people.
Does there need to be an aircraft home ported in Bremerton as well as Everett? Do you think that's too close together?
No, I'm not worried about strategic missiles. I mean, it's a different world when Russia.
I mean, spending the money to maintain aircraft carriers so close to one another. Would one of these bases work?
No, I don't believe so. I don't think they have the capacity for handling the aircraft carriers. In the military, one thing you learn is you always have to have surge capacity, because if there begins a real shooting war in the Pacific, we're going to want to surge carriers over to this side, and we have to have capacity here to handle that.
You know, I do business retention for a living, and I think one of our key retention strategies has to be with the shipyard. And in that 54% of this county's economic activity comes either directly or indirectly from the naval presence here. That means, as Bill mentioned, leveraging our geographic strength and some of the competitive strengths that we have here, but it also means, as Congressman Dix has done, continuously working to improve the competitiveness of the presence here. Some of that's doing small things, like making infrastructure investments within the naval presence here in Kitsap County, including, in a big way, the explosive handling wharf, which is a significant investment. It means things like expanding our apprenticeship programs, which are very, very important to the long-term competitiveness of the naval presence here. It's part of the reason we established the new mechanical engineering program at Olympic College, because the average engineer at the shipyard is over 50 years old. And so ensuring that there's a consistent and growing pipeline of workers from Olympic College and into the shipyard is very, very important. So that's sort of phase one for me. I was speaking with someone, you asked more broadly about defense spending and the role we'll play. You know, I think part of this means working as an entire state delegation to protect the presence of the military, not just of the Navy here in Kitsap County, but of the broader military presence throughout the state of Washington. The largest employer in Pierce County is Joint Base Lewis McChord, and so you see pretty much throughout this state, you go up to Everett, throughout the state you see significant presence, both as an employer and importantly as an important strategic asset for the U.S. military. I was speaking with someone senior in the Navy recently, and I said, as we look at cuts, what do you think? Where are there opportunities? And he gave me three numbers. He said 2,000, 60,000, and 380 billion. He said 60,000 is the number of budget analysts that work for the Department of Defense. 60,000. 2,000 is the number of different audit systems that they have within the DoD. 2,000 different systems. And 380 billion was his estimate of the cost overruns that we had from the 2008 spending program. So his suggestion was, I think where there's opportunities to save money that don't hurt the presence of the Navy in Kitsap County or the military presence throughout the state.
What about bringing troops home from Afghanistan? Is this a priority to you? Would you guys make this a priority if you're in that seat? And how is Congress going to address that one sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I think the effort in Afghanistan was the right mission in terms of trying to deal with Al-Qaeda and the threat post 9/11. I do think it's time to start to draw down our presence there and bring our troops home in a responsible way that protects them and that ensures that we don't see that become just a hub of terrorist activity. That means a few things. One, making sure that we're adequately training the Afghan national forces so that they can take ownership of the threats there. It means working to ensure that Afghanistan starts to develop stronger relationships with its neighboring countries, including trade relationships, so that they have a more stable economy and they're not simply dependent upon the United States and its presence in their country.
Do you still have faith those things can happen?
I do.
I mean, there's these stories about Afghan soldiers now shooting at Americans and things like that.
I do. I mean, by most, and none of this is easy. I mean, none of this is easy, and I've got friends over there, and I know Bill does too. And I want to make sure that that we're conscious of the men and women that we have over there right now, and make sure that we phase them down in a way that's responsible and protects them, but also doesn't create just a hub of terrorist activity when we leave.
So I certainly support bringing our troops back. I think maintaining a small presence there, doing some training with the Afghan National Police or the ANA, the Afghan National Army, makes sense. Having a presence there, given its proximity to both Iran and Pakistan, is a good thing, I think. But we certainly need to bring our troops back. Nation building, which is what I was doing over there, it was. I want to be careful because we have people over there who are serving in harm's way, but. I don't think it was effective. I think our initial mission there of going after Al-Qaeda was the right thing, but then we expanded to nation building. That's not a role for the military. I was building schools that weren't going to have teachers for a couple generations. They're there's that much of a dearth of the infrastructure. And then typically the schools get blown up by the Taliban or be used to shoot at us shortly thereafter anyway. So I think we pushed too hard there in terms of expanding our presence, and that was a mistake. And I think it's been much too costly, and I think it's been costly both in terms of dollars, but much more importantly in terms of human lives. In terms of, we can maintain a presence in terms of training A&A and the ANP. That's what our special forces do. They're trained, they're exceptionally well at that. Anytime you have as many people as we do over there, you're going to have some of this blue on green violence. And it was, we worked closely with the ANA, Afghan National Police when I was there, and we didn't have any issues, but if they had wanted to, there was nothing you could do about it because you're out walking in the villages with them.
You both mentioned that kind of it was a good idea to go in because you knew Al Qaeda was there. We wanted to go and kind of combat that right away. That still exists places in the world. There's problems in Syria. There's other problems. Is this something the U.S. should be doing? Is this something Congress should be seeking out ways that the U.S. can still intervene, or is there a different way that it should be happening?
We were attacked out of Afghanistan, right? So going after them, that was the right thing to do. Doing it in a soft, the way we did it, using the special forces and paramilitary was exactly the right way to do it. So we couldn't get a big footprint. So I think that was the right thing. We have a tremendous capability with our special forces, and be able to project that overseas. We're seeing that in Yemen and different places. Is a much better way to do it than trying to establish a firm footprint and maintaining bases in those places. So I think it is something that we have to be able to do.
Do we have a responsibility? Maybe that's.
We have a responsibility to ourselves, yes. Do we have a responsibility to policing countries? Do we have a responsibility to doing nation building? As part of the global society and as using our State Department and working with other nations, sure. Taking the lead with our Defense Department, I don't think so.
I don't know that we'll disagree a lot on this. I think threats exist, and it's important to use the military where appropriate, but it's also important to acknowledge that not every threat can be fixed with a bomb or a tank. I embrace what the State Department has referred to as smart power, which is the notion that you need to have the strongest military possible to deal when there's a military threat, but you also have to acknowledge that there's other tools in the toolbox, diplomacy and economic and legal sanctions. Even foreign aid are elements of the tools in the toolbox. The challenge is, my dad always used to say, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We have to acknowledge that there's other tools in our foreign policy toolbox that may be more appropriate to dealing with some of these issues.
Give me an example.
For example, I think sanctions are something, you look at the threat of Iran right now, and sanctions are something right now that our country is using, both economic and legal sanctions, to basically try to tighten the noose around the leadership of Iran. I think appropriately, President Obama hasn't taken the use of the military off the table, certainly if Iran continues to pursue nuclear capabilities. But the starting point, rather than seeing the use of the military as the starting point has been the use of economic and legal sanctions and working as part of a broader multilateral, multinational effort to try to, put pressure on Iran to make smarter decisions. We now have nations across this world who have to choose between doing business with Iran or doing business with the United States.
Could I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Based on that, Governor Romney just recently is advocating increasing the military by at least 100,000 people, boots on the ground. Given the percentage of the budget that the Pentagon currently takes up, should Mr. Romney become president, would you endorse an expansion of the military?
I think it's important that we have a more agile military to meet the threats that we need, and exactly how that gets expanded and what degree, I think, is open for some discussion. But the nature of threats is changing. You now have things like terrorism and cyber warfare that we didn't even think of decades ago, and it means having more agile military to address those sorts of issues. And so that means our spending and our approach to how we form the military needs to change with the changing nature of our threats.
So what you're saying is not necessarily that you would endorse or pay for 100,000 more troops on the ground, but you would look more selectively? Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I think at the very least, we need to do that. We need to make sure, both in terms of the type of investments that we're making, we need to make sure from an equipment standpoint and from a capability standpoint, we're meeting the new nature of threats. What that means in terms of how many more troops that we need, I think is an open discussion.
So I might take a little bit different perspective. And I would say also that terrorism is something that's been around for a long time. I was in 1983, Beirut bombing, and I was off of Beirut in 86 and 87. But I think in terms of that and the Governor Romney's plan, I think our biggest national security threat is our debt and our deficit. And if we don't address that, we are not going to be able to maintain our military over the next 20 and 30 and 40 years. We're not going to be able to sustain our promises to our people, our veterans, and seniors. And so I would be really hard pressed to support a budget that would increase the defense spending today, given the threat level that we have today and where we stand. So I guess I differ a little bit with Derek on this, is I would probably be, it would be really hard for me to support increased spending, and I think we actually have to put, defense spending has to be one of the things that's on the table to look at efficiencies and ways to improve our spending there. Because I think, again, we can defend ourselves for the next 10 and 15 years. It's after that, who's going to, how are we going to have the fiscal stability? Are we going to have the foundation to continue to do that and to continue to have the military that we do? And if we don't address the debt and the deficit, we aren't going to.
Can I follow up on that?
Go ahead.
In a few years, I think the combination of entitlements and debt is going to eat up most, if not all, the budget. And a lot of people believe that once a country's debt percentage over gross national product hits around 200%, it's almost unsustainable. And I think our country, if we don't make some changes, is going to hit 200% in a few short years, and maybe even 400% a few years after that. I worry that the Democrats won't have the courage to decrease entitlements and social programs, and I worry that the Republicans won't have the courage to decrease military spending and increase taxes. I think it's a huge issue that's not being faced very well and needs to be faced pretty darn soon. What do you propose we do?
Well, again, that's exactly why I'm running for Congress, because I think that politicians and our political system has been unable to address that. And that's why sending somebody back to Congress who is not a politician, who doesn't want to have a career in politics, is the way to do it. We have got to break that link between job advancement and taking tough votes. And it is, we have to address it, and we have to address it now, and it's going to take putting everything on the table, which is why I get so frustrated when the Democrats, for instance, are attacking Medicare as we know it, when it's actually a bipartisan plan that has been thought about by very smart people, has been compromised to, and worked. It might not be the perfect plan. I mean, there's a lot of smart people out there, but we have to work on it. Medicaid, right, is expanding greatly, and it's crowding out education spending. Again, we have to address that. And we see those impacts on the local level, and we have to address it. And it's going to take coming together, and I think it's going to take the middle coming together, right? It's let's not let the extremists drive this conversation. Let's come together and embrace it, and we can do that. And that's going to take a conversation with the American people, but we can do it. America is good enough. We can do this, and we will do it to sustain our future for our children and our grandchildren.
Well, I've just spent the last 2 years doing this. Right. I mean, in the last 2 years, we've cut more money out of state spending than ever in the history of the state. And the budget that passed in the state Senate this year was unique in a couple regards. One, it was a balanced budget, which is something they haven't been able to do in Congress. And two, it was bipartisan. There was only 2 no votes on the budget that we passed out of the state Senate because we wrote it together and we passed it together. I mean, that I can tell you were surprised by that, but and. You know, it is a fact. We only had 2 no votes. We passed a debt reduction proposal, a constitutional amendment that I co-authored that'll be on the ballot in November to reduce state debt, which is the fastest growing area of state spending that your editorial board supported as we were going through this last legislative session. It passed in a bipartisan way. It passed with near unanimous support. So I actually have experience making these tough decisions and working on these issues. I think when it comes to tackling the national debt, there's basically 3 tools in the toolbox. One is cuts. We cannot afford a government that does everything, and it means making those very difficult decisions. I actually don't think that we need to increase defense spending. I think we need to be smarter about our defense spending. And just as I used as the example that I heard from the leader in the Navy, there are things that we're investing dollars in that don't make sense. And so we have to be smarter about the investments that we're making. I think that type of tough conversation needs to be had. 2, we do need to look at the revenue side as well. Looking at doing away with tax breaks that are unproductive, and at a time where we're having a conversation around cutting programs like Pell Grants and cutting programs like Medicaid, the notion that we wouldn't let expire tax breaks for millionaires, I think doesn't make sense. And then 3rd, I think we need to look at growing our economy. I work in economic development for a living. The long-term sustainability of our government gets a whole lot better if we get people back to work.
What about inflation? That's another way to kind of cure the problem. You think that's a good idea to print money?
Well, if we don't get the deficit taken care of, that is in essence what we're doing today. And you look at the quantitative easing and all that, we are printing money, and we're going to have to get ahead of this. And most people here lived through the times, remembers the early 80s, right, when interest rates were 16, 18%. And that can come back to us if we don't get this thing addressed. And that's, again, why this has to be our number one solution, priority, I think. And it's going to take, again, coming together and addressing it. And it's going to be hard, and I think a lot of politicians going through that, push this thing forward, are going to have to be willing to get fired.
I mean, it's kind of the easy way out, but how do you feel about printing more money? What's your reaction to that?
No, I think, you can't just keep kicking the can down the road. I mean, we've reached that point where there needs to be a bipartisan conversation around making tough decisions to get our country back on track. I mean, I have 2 little kids. I've got a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. I mean, the most common question I get is, gosh, why on earth would you run for Congress when Congress is such a mess and you have 2 little kids? And my response is because Congress is a total mess and I have 2 little kids. I worry about what kind of country they grow up in. I don't want them to grow up in Greece.
What do each of you bring? I mean, that's one that kind of bugs me. The Congress, this perception that it's a mess and that your approval ratings are so low. What are you going to do? Whether it's personally, whether it's in the way you deal with people, like you mentioned, the extremists taking over. If you're sitting in that chamber next year, what are you going to do to earn back some of the trust? What do you ignore some of those issues that are divisive? Do you focus on something else? What do you tell people?
Part of it is some of the things we've already talked about, working across the aisle, working in a bipartisan way. I think part of what exhausts people about what's happening in Congress is you literally have people defining success as making sure that the other guys look like failures. I've never defined success that way. I think that gig is up. I mean, we've got too many legitimate challenges that need to be tackled for this partisan bickering to continue. And so part of it is simply demonstrating the ability to work across the aisle to solve problems again. Part of it is remembering who your boss is. Over the last year, in the last interim, I did 51 town hall meetings in front of every Kiwanis Club, Rotary Club, Chamber of Commerce, church group, neighborhood group, you name it. I stood in front of them and was accountable to them. I told them what I was working on, the good, the bad, and the ugly of what was happening in state government, and I listened to what was their concerns, and I tried to be accountable to them. And I think that's often missing from our politics right now. I think part of what's missing from our politics right now is the notion, I think oftentimes people feel like our elected officials are playing by a different set of rules. I mean, a few years back when the legislature got a pay increase, I took my pay increase and I gave it to scholarships at every high school in the district that I represent and at the community colleges in the district I represent, because that's how I paid for college, was with financial aid and my community actually supporting my ability to do that. When the legislature cut state employee pay over the last couple of years, I voluntarily cut my own pay because I think it's time for our elected officials to stop playing by a different set of rules. I think those are the types of things that engender actually turning this dialogue around and trying to get us back on track.
Speaking of money.
Can I just
Oh, yeah,
jump
go
in there
ahead.
quickly? Sorry about that. First, I think that number one, rhetoric is important. And when you speak to strong Republican groups or strong Democrat groups, it's important not to use inflammatory rhetoric. And there certainly are some YouTube videos showing some what I would say aggressive rhetoric on your side about characterizing Republican positions when you're talking to Democratic groups. So I think being careful about using inflammatory rhetoric, and especially with YouTube, it gets out there. Second, I would say that it is about having a good conversation and bringing people together into what's important. But I think also what people want in Congress is progress. And so my goal in terms of going to going to Congress is to focus on trying to move the needle on things that I can. And number one would be timber policy and forest products. Forest products is an area that's of great importance to this district. It's something I have a lot of experience in. And a lot of people would argue that the national forest, the harvest policy and our management policy there is broken. I think by going there, rolling up my sleeves, focusing on that, it's not a high profile issue. It certainly is for the district. If we can move the needle on that, people can see some progress. That's going to bring back some support for government and faith that Congress can do something. It's also going to be focusing on trade and the military. So again, focusing on issues that are important to the district, that I actually know something about and think I can move the needle on, that will restore faith in Congress, I think. A small amount.
Oh, yeah.
Bill, you indicated you're not a politician, you don't want to make a career
Yep.
out of politics. If you get elected, what kind of commitment are you making?
You know, the number one goal would be if we can get the budget solved. So I can do that in 2 years. I'll be done in 2 years. I don't think I can, but my view from private industry is that people can maintain the focus and intensity to really get something done and really focus on it for 8 or 10 years. Obviously, there's a whole incentive group. The incentives in Congress is to stay longer and longer and longer. I think that's kind of backwards, but that would be my focus, would be 8 or 10 years, not longer. I got 2 little kids, actually a little bit younger than Derek's even, that I want to come back to and focus on. I've got a career, I want to come back to
That's
that.
what Doc Hastings said, he's still there. Let me ask a question going back to money. You're both in the campaign and you're aware of the need to fund the campaign.
Yep.
So tell us your ideas on campaign finance reform. Apparently, it seems that Congress can't get anything done because they spend most of their time chasing money. So how would you change that system at this point, given the opportunity?
I don't know much about this, so I'll start, so Derek can finish with a better answer. I would say, smart people, good people, McCain, Feingold, they've tried to solve it. And something, we've got to do something to take the money out of politics. And I don't know how, but I can tell you, the first question I got when I said, hey, I'm thinking about running for Congress, the very first question was, well, how are you going to raise enough money? I was lucky enough I was able to contribute a big chunk of my own money into it. But it shouldn't require that. And that was just to draw equal. And that's, $500,000 is a ton of money. That's not even close to what it's going to require. And people are saying it's going to be $2.5 million per side, right? Crazy amounts of money. And unfortunately, you do have to spend a lot of your time calling and that. And I believe that because I've self-financed to a degree and I'm independent, that I'll be able to be independent on that. But it's hard. So I wish I had a better answer for you. I don't. Derek's got a better answer, I'm sure.
Are you being supported by the National Committee?
They've named me a contender, which that plus $4 will get you a cup of coffee.
They've not contributed, they're not finished.
Not as of yet.
My approach has been, by and large, to run a people-powered campaign. I mean, when we kicked off our campaign here in Bremerton, we had nearly 300 people there. I mean, it was a packed house just a couple blocks from here. When we had our kickoff in Gig Harbor, we had nearly 300 people there. In Port Angeles, we had a couple hundred people there. In Tacoma, we had 385 people there. And I'm proud of the fact that we're able to actually get just normal citizens to show up and to be supportive. I mean, I'm not in a position to be able to write a $500,000 check to myself, and appreciate Bill's commitment that was all he was going to write to himself, because I've got 2 kids and a mortgage. But I've got a lot of friends, and I'm grateful, though I don't have deep pockets, I've got deep friendships, and a lot of them have shown up and at the various events we've had.
But, I mean, PACs are an important
Yeah,
part
how
of
do you say-
finance.
but
I
how
don't
do you
know how
say
much,
no when,
yeah.
are you being supported by the National Committee?
I don't think so. I mean, what we've basically, I don't know if they've made a financial contribution or not. I'd have to go back and look.
Can I ask one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some people say we're going toward a financial train wreck with sequestration. I went to Norm Diggs' farewell dinner, and there was two issues he threw out on the table. That was one of them, the other was cyber warfare.
Mhm.
How are we gonna deal with sequestration?
To me, this is an example of how broken our Congress is. The notion that we're actually going to make, that the Congress may actually choose to drive us off a cliff, to me is nuts. I mean, it is not a statement of opinion, it is a statement of fact that if you have sequestration take place and the tax-mageddon that they've called it, where all of the tax cuts expire, it is a fact that we will go into another recession. So, part of it is this is where the politics needs to be checked at the door, and we have to be willing to come together in a bipartisan way and make the difficult decisions to actually balance the budget, stop kicking the can down the road, and avoid that type of, sequestration would have an enormous impact, on defense spending in particular, where we've heard from the United States military that they've got concerns about the impacts on our national security if cuts happen to that degree. And so, to me, it is both a sign of how broken it is, and part of the reason I'm running. I mean, that we've got to be willing to step up and work across the aisle and get these things done.
But can you imagine running a business where you've got a 1-year time frame, and after that you have no idea if you're going to have any money again? A company as big as our government saying, well, we can't make any investment decisions, right? We can't make any hiring decisions. It's crazy. It's so inefficient. So to Derek's point, that is a symptom of what's wrong, and the fact that last year we had it coming to the brink and they kicked it down the road 1 year. That doesn't, if you're Boeing, you're trying to make a decision about whether to invest in something, and you have that degree of uncertainty out there, either you're not going to, or you're going to invest overseas, where there is a more stable fiscal policy, and you can understand what may or may not be happening. So I don't have we can't really influence whether they're going to come together by January, by the time one of us is going to be back there. But as Derek said, it is a symptom of what is wrong.
And working in economic, Bill's comment about the impact to employers is really important, because what businesses need more than anything other from government is trust and predictability. And right now you have neither. You have neither the ability to trust what's happening, nor is there any predictability about where our country's headed.
Anything? Well, we're getting real close to our hour anyway, so what do we can save a little time for a longer closing statement and give each 2 minutes. We'll let Bill go, and then Derek can conclude.
Sure. Well, thank you all very much for being here. It's interesting to have this exchange of ideas and go over stuff. I think once again, focusing on, I'm not a politician, and again, the reason that's important is you're not being beholden to political machinery and the political process, which is keeping so many people in office. Combat veteran, 2 combat tours. To me, there's something, it doesn't make sense to me that Washington State doesn't have anybody with that experience in its delegation, given how important the military is to this area. What's that?
There's no one in Washington that has been.
Very few. There's a couple who are now. Yep. So we have to have that. The global experience is very important. I think, again, this district is a trade district. We are part of the Pacific Rim. Having that experience is critical. My job over the last 20 years has been working in business and employing people and hiring people, and on occasion having to fire people. It's hard. But it's part of knowing and working in business. And so understanding the second and third order effects of legislation, understanding how that's going to impact jobs, I think is of great importance. My experience base is, if you have my level of experience in the military, international, and business, you can't be a politician, right? You couldn't have done both. And similarly, I would argue that if you have been a politician, you can't have that level of experience across the board in areas that have great importance for this district. Once again, thank you.
Well, I'm running because I think we need to get people back to work. It's what I do for a living. I work in economic development in Pierce County. I've met with hundreds of business owners with an eye towards keeping them and growing them. And that experience, I think, will help me in Congress in helping our small businesses. You know, I've demonstrated the ability to get things done on jobs, and we see that here in Bremerton as we see projects like the movie theater move forward and see the effort at Olympic College. It's why I was named Leader of the Year 3 times by the Washington Economic Development Association and was Enterprise Washington's Business Institute Legislative Business Star. It's why groups that care about jobs, like not just the Kitsap Labor Council, but the Kitsap Realtors and the Kitsap Home Builders, have endorsed my campaign. You know, working to help our veterans. I was the Washington Department of Veteran Affairs Legislator of the Year and was recognized by the Paralyzed Veterans of America for work that I've done on behalf of veterans, because I think if you fight for our country, you shouldn't have to fight for a job when you come home. And a lot of the work that I've been doing in the legislature is focused on making sure that our veterans can transition into civilian employment successfully. And working in a bipartisan way. It's one thing to talk about bipartisanship. It's another to actually demonstrate the ability to be bipartisan. You know, that's why I'm endorsed by not just every Kitsap commissioner and by the sheriff and prosecutor, but by the county assessor, who's a Republican. You know, it's why I'm endorsed by 7 members of the Bremerton City Council and Mayor Patty Lent, who was a Republican. It's why I'm endorsed by 5 members of the Port Orchard City Council and former Mayor Larry Capola, and by 6 members of the Gig Harbor City Council and Mayor Chuck Hunter and former Mayor Gretchen Wilbert, both of whom are Republicans. It's why council members from Bainbridge and Paulsville have endorsed my campaign. You know, the folks who are concerned about jobs, you know, have seen me work with them to get things done. You know, we have got to move this country forward. We've got to start working together. And I'm here to ask for your endorsement.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you guys' time.
I forgot to ask for that. I do
See
mean
how
it.
it all-
I would like for it as well.
We assumed that you came.